Now, Josh is an experienced individual on both sides of the boardroom. He is a sought-after leader, communicator, and advisor. He has worked for both municipal and provincial governments. At the age of 21, he was working for Alison Redford in the government. He has a unique understanding of the issues facing Calgary and our province. He's also he's recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee and Platinum Jubilee medals for his contributions to his community. In 2016, Josh was recognized as a SAIT Student Outstanding Young Alumni. In 2023, Josh was recognized with the Calgary Award for Heritage by the City of Calgary for his sustained contribution to heritage in the Calgary City. In 2024, he was recognized as one of the 20 compelling Calgarians by the Calgary Herald. He sits on the boards of the Calgary Motor Association as a regional advisor and on the AMA Board of Governors. He's a very active community volunteer, serving on the boards of the Women in Need Society, as the board chair, the History and Heroes Alberta Foundation, and is a past chairman of the Calgary Military Family Resource Center. Come on, Frank. Good evening. He has a diploma in Administrative Information Management from SAIT and a certificate in Public Relations from Mount Royal University. And he's also completed an ICD, which stands for Institute Corporation Directors Governance Essentials Program. And he's the third generation of Calgary. So I'd like to introduce Josh Philbin.
Who helped shape it and how they shaped it. Reusing buildings and materials make good environmental sense. The greenest building is the building that already exists. It also promotes a compact urban form, making multi-mode transportation more practical, walking, scooters, cycling, public transit, cars, because they're more lower to the ground, and it creates more walkable communities. So some of the pieces that we'll look at is the economic, social, and environmental benefits of heritage. So from a labor perspective, studies have shown that rehabilitation projects create 20 to 30% more jobs than new construction. For example, $1 million worth spent on rehabilitation of historic properties created 14.6 jobs, while $1 million spent on new construction created 11.2 jobs. There's a higher proportion of construction costs for environmental conservation project that goes to the labor force than the new built projects because of the skill sets that are needed in order to restore and conserve those heritage properties. And building industries typically estimate that the project costs of 50% labor and 50% material for new construction, while labor costs for heritage construction are between 60 and 80% of the total cost. In 2017, Parks Canada's National Historic Sites contributed $612 million to Canada's GDP, $82 million in tax revenue, and 6,100 full-time jobs. From a tourism perspective, so Calgary's key attractions include Stephen Avenue Mall and other local historic neighborhoods like Kensington and Inglewood. Stats Canada has reported in the past that 25% of overnight visitors to Calgary participated in a cultural activity, with most of them visiting some kind of historic site. And of course in Calgary there are multiple kind of heritage districts. You have Inglewood, 4th Street, Kensington, Mission Cliff Bungalow, and of course Stephen Avenue. From an economic perspective, Calgary Economic Development has identified places as a focus area to attract new residents. The idea of adaptive reuse, the size, design, and lower rents typical to historic building make them more flexible for entrepreneurs, startups, and have lower overhead costs. Some recent examples are Neo Financial moved into the Hudson's Bay Company downtown, so they operate 2 floors of it. And typically neighborhoods that include older, smaller buildings house a significantly greater concentration of jobs in the innovation economy than those areas with only larger, newer construction. So when you think of Calgary, the warehouse district, you have lots of kind of startups, smaller organizations that need a smaller footprint than those who are in the downtown in the big glass and steel high-rises. And then of course the social well-being. So older buildings provide some of the city's most affordable housing. The historic buildings improve mental well-being. They're on that human scale. It's a more comfortable place to live and work. And of course the walkability promotes health. And you have the ability to tell diverse stories, such as Calgary's Chinatown, which most people don't realize that this Chinatown is actually the third location that our Chinatown has been in. The first one was over in East Village, the second one was around 1st Street and 10th Avenue, and then finally its third location now at Riverfront, 2nd Avenue and Center Street. And then the cultural aspects of heritage buildings. Heritage buildings contribute to our sense of place and community identity. Contemporary Calgary, for example, is the reminder of the centennial from 1967, and a cultural organization which is now Contemporary Calgary. Of course, it was the planetarium. And it's recognized for its brutalism and the importance that brutalism played in our city's past, even though many people don't overly like brutalist style of architecture. And then of course the environmental trends as well, so that newer buildings are the most energy intensive and older buildings are smaller and thus less energy intensive, and buildings from pre-industrial periods are likely contain more natural, low energy and less chemical based materials. And of course, the diverting waste. So Victoria, for example, created a zero waste where they require up to, I think, 70% of demolitions to be salvaged rather than going to the to the dump. 50% of the buildings in Canada were constructed before 1970, and demolishing a 2,500 square foot house sends 60 tons of debris to the landfill, whereas retrofits can often significantly improve energy efficiency. And it's unsustainable to demolish all of these older buildings to build new energy efficient buildings, because essentially whatever you're getting for in the energy efficiency you've sent to the dump with all the embedded carbon that those buildings have essentially emitted, and of course all the emissions to demolish and take them to the dump as well. And some of the hurdles that you have when it comes to heritage, you have things like demolition by neglect, where you often have vacant buildings that are sitting there without a purpose. You have building code issues, where older buildings typically are not up to code, whether it's stairs, accessibility, etc. Also the costs. So to retrofit is sometimes cost prohibitive, the rehabilitation costs, and then the insurance of replacement costs, etc. And then of course perceptions of, the limitations of owners when it comes to what they can do with their property, and then of course bureaucratic red tape. So looking at it from a Calgary context, we'll look at the heritage assets, the inventory, and designations. So we kind of think about heritage as kind of the big pie. So the big green pie is the heritage assets, which there's about 4,000 of them that were identified through a 2019-2020 windshield survey. And these are all privately owned residential buildings that were constructed before 1945. They retain most of their original style, design, details, and construction materials. And this was determined through a visual assessment that essentially consultants and volunteers would walk or drive all the streets and kind of do a check, check, check. And if it hit all the checks, it was then considered a heritage asset. So this map kind of shows, obviously, all of Calgary's older neighborhoods, and so lots of the heritage assets are in Inglewood, Elbow Park, Mission Cliff Bungalow, Upper Lower Mount Royal, Hillhurst, Sunnyside, Kensington, which makes sense given that those are Calgary's older neighborhoods. So then when you look at the inventory, so the inventory has about 960 65 resources. It's been around since the mid-80s, and it's a permanent, ongoing, or living record, and it's a repository of facts and information. It's used as a planning tool by the City of Calgary, developers, homeowners that identify clusters of historic buildings. It encourages civic engagement and provides a sense of place. It's a great starting point for anyone who's looking for heritage resources in a certain neighborhood or area. It grows every year. We add anywhere from 30 to 40 sites to the inventory every year. It's also kind of the waiting room for formal designation. Anyone who's interested in having their property designated as a municipal historic resource first has to be added to the inventory. And so we would work with them to hire a researcher to research their property, write the statement of significance and the character defining elements. And so this is just the inventory map. You can search based by community, development era, architectural style, is it designated, is it demolished? Because anything that has been listed on the inventory and is later demolished, we keep it on the inventory as that historical record. Just being on the inventory does not come with any legal protection. So those 965 sites, only 163 of them have that formal legal designation. So that small orange circle, those are the municipal historic resources. So those are sites that are designated by the City of Calgary through a bylaw that regulates their ability to not be demolished or significantly altered. The other great thing about the inventory is the city's overview aerial photos is in there as well. So you can look at aerial photos dating back to 1924, and you can slide over from present day to 1924 and see how the city has changed. You can see, you know, a building that was built in the 1950s, what would have been there in the 1924 aerial photo. You can spend hours looking at all the different aerial maps to see how Calgary has changed through all of those maps. So when we look at the inventory, potential sites are brought forward by the community, city staff, property owners, and other interested parties. In order to be listed on the inventory, a property has to be at least 25 years old and have one of these evaluation criteria. We have 9 of them. So for example, activity, it's a resource that must be directly associated with an activity that has made a significant contribution to the broad pattern of municipal history. In this case, the Big 4 building at Stampede Park, it has activity value. Event value is events that include planned or unplanned gatherings that mark local watershed moments, official recognition of something, or the celebration of an activity or cultural practice, for example, the Olympic saddle dome. Institution is organizations that were founded for educational, religious, charitable, leisure, or social purposes, in this case, schools such as the Bridgeland School. People or person is a resource that must be directly associated with the life of a significant person in the municipality's past. And in this case, the King residence, which is located in Hillhurst, has people significance for Violet King, who was the first Black woman to become a lawyer in Canada and the first Black individual to graduate law school in Alberta. Her brother Theodore King also lived there, was very active in the Black Porters movement. It's a very simple 1.5 story Queen Anne Revival house, but the fact that the Kings lived there makes it historically significant for its people and person value. Style design, not so much, but person value, it's significantly significant. The next one is style value. So a resource that embodies the distinctive characteristic of a style and exhibits the execution of a design's intent in a prescriptive or a prescribed or prescriptive manner. And in the case is the Bank of Montreal building on Stephen Avenue, which I think is now Good Life, and in the past it was A&B Sounds, etc. And then design value, so a resource that exhibits a contrived intent or preliminary plan in the engagement of its functional and architectural elements that does not merely replicate established style or pattern, rather it's unconventional or original in its plan and execution. And that example is the 12th Avenue River Bridge, or the McDonald Bridge, which is just on the other side of Stampede Park that you would take into Ramsey. Construction value is a resource that embodies the distinctive characteristics of a period or method of construction, or exhibit innovative or local unique construction, and that's the Rideau Towers. They're a very interesting concrete-based buildings from the 1950s, 1960s. There's, I think, 3 or 4 of them that sit at the top of Rideau, but they're a really good example of 1960s architecture. Landmark, a pretty basic one that has a prominent or acquired a special visual value that transcends its function, and it contributes to the distinctive character of the municipality. Obviously, the Calgary Tower is a very natural building that has landmark value, and then symbolic value is a resource that has acquired special sentiment or symbolic value that transcends its function. And this resource has a collective meaning in the municipality that's not immediately apparent. And that's the Eau Claire smokestack, which of course is remnants from the old Calgary Transit bus barns that were in Eau Claire. Many people don't know that was an industrial part of Calgary. You had a lumber mill there that came off the Bow River. Peter Prince had a lumber mill there. He kind of created the diversion, created Princess Island, and of course the Prince House at Heritage Park was moved from Eau Claire as part of the saving it, but the Princess Island comes from the Prince family. And so once the evaluation is done, a site could have anywhere of those 9 criteria. I think the most that one has, is the Saddle Dome, and I think it has about 7 or 8 of those values. But as long as it has one, and typically for houses, residential properties, they typically would have design or style value. They're then formally added to the inventory. And then the Board of Heritage Calgary adds sites to the inventory. That's done on a quarterly basis, and then we communicate with those property owners, letting them know that their property's been added to the inventory, and we add the site to the public inventory so it's available for everyone to go and read the statement of significance. They can see any of the Henderson's directory listings. We also look at historical land titles, because that's how we typically will name a resource, based on land titles, etc. And then sites that are listed on the inventory may be eligible for municipal heritage designation, otherwise known as legal protection. So some of the benefits of designation are it prevents a historic resource from being demolished and requires heritage planning approval for alterations to predefined historical elements. So as part of the designation bylaw process, the property owner will work closely with the heritage planners to decide what elements they want regulated. 9 times out of 10, it's just the facade that's regulated, so you could still update your bathroom, your kitchen, make changes inside, but it's the outside that's regulated. So say, for example, you had wood siding, you'd have to keep that wood siding, you could replace it like for like, but then there's also grants that are available to help offset some of those costs. It allows the owner to retain all rights to the property. You can apply for land use changes, you can do home-based businesses. Nothing affects your use and enjoyment of the property. All designation prevents is the demolition or significant alteration of that property. And the legal process to designate a site as a municipal historic resource is governed by the Historic Resources Act. And so that act requires municipal councils to pass designation bylaws to designate sites as municipal historic resources. The province also has the ability to designate sites as provincial historic resources. So kind of once the site is added to the inventory, that box at the bottom, the owner would then reach out to the City of Calgary and say, hey, I'm interested in designating my property. Let's work together on drafting that bylaw. So the heritage planners would kind of come up with, okay, these are all the character defining elements that are laid out in the statement of significance. This is what we would recommend as part of the designation bylaw. They'd go back and forth with the property owner, and then the property owner would then sign off, they'd approve the bylaw. The city then provides 60 days notice to the owner, and then council passes 3 readings of the bylaw, and it's then registered on title. So we sometimes have property owners or realtors that will call us up and say, hey, my client bought a house, didn't know it had legal protection. And we said, well, you clearly didn't do your due diligence because it's listed on land title. And so that's the big thing is if it's listed on the inventory, but there's no caveat on the land title, it doesn't have any legal protection. It just means it's just on the inventory. Versus if it's listed on the land title, that means it's legally protected, and so that means that the property can't be demolished, significantly altered, etc. It has to be owner initiated. In Alberta, the Historic Resources Act requires municipalities to compensate owners for perceived lost value. And so based on that, no municipality in Alberta has designated a property against an owner's wishes. It's owner buy-in. So it's that carrot approach of we have incentives, we have grants that are available to incentivize property owners to designate as a municipal historic resource. The province, on the other hand, yes.
No, finish your thought.
Sure. The province, on the other hand, has the ability to designate a property and not pay compensation, but they do that very, very rarely. It's only happened, I think, about 5 or 6 times in the last 25 years.
So my question is, so there's a separate bylaw for each and every house?
Yeah.
And it's unique to that property?
Yeah.
So the city has a slew of bylaws
Yeah.
on their books for, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, there would be, if the 156 designations, there would be an individual designation bylaw for each of those designations. So once a property is designated, we then add that bylaw to the inventory. So any designated property, anyone can go look at that designation bylaw and see what exactly is regulated in the designation bylaw. So that's for, if people are selling, buying, whatever it is, that's all publicly available through the designation process. So some of the incentives that the city of Calgary has, they have both planning tools and grants that are available. So they have heritage commercial areas where they've looked at things like direct control bylaws, which we'll talk about later in here. They have density transfers and sometimes relaxations for heritage as well. So again, kind of just looking at designated inventory and heritage assets, you can see where a majority of heritage properties, whether they're assets, inventoried, or designated, reside in the city of Calgary. We have a very unique ability in Calgary called a density transfer, which is available in the downtown, the East Village, and the Beltline. So if the owner of a heritage asset agrees to legally protect it, they gain the ability to sell and transfer density. So in simple terms, say you had a property downtown that was, say, zoned for 10 stories and your building was only 5 stories, you could sell or transfer those 5 stories of your air rights to either another site you owned or to another developer, and that's cash. So number 1 Fire Hall sold their density, Knox United has sold their density, and places that have bought that density is the Bow Tower. When they were building, they bought density, and so did the Petro-Canada Towers in the 1980s. So a number of heritage assets in the downtown have sold their density and have then used that cash to operate their building through a foundation or a reserve fund or an endowment. There is the ability to regenerate that density if you put money into the restoration of your project, but right now the density transfer only exists in the East Village, the downtown, and the Beltline. And then so a direct control, Calgary just did their first direct control in Bankview. It was passed in early 2024. So a direct control or a heritage area direct control is a unique set of land use district or zoning rules for all the properties in that defined area. So for example here, in this block in Mission, I think it's 5 or 6 of these properties are all included in the direct control. So these direct control districts will preserve the heritage characters of blocks, but it doesn't prevent demolition. So it limits things like how tall your property can be. It says that you have to have a front porch. It limits the roof slope. So it's all architectural controls that any new development or builds would fit in with the character of that direct control in Mission. So it supports the conservation of the heritage context of a block through specific architectural controls. It supports conservation of individual heritage assets through some limits on redevelopment potential without preventing demolition or compatible redevelopment. It considers the form, scale, and design of pre-existing, so pre-1945 houses, and it protects a snapshot in time of the historic context of that area. You have to have at least 50% of the building on each block face identified as a heritage asset and have a support of most of the property owners on each block face. So in the case of this direct control, one property owner essentially got all of their neighbors to sign on to that direct control. There was a little wrinkle when one of the houses sold. There was a new owner, but they convinced them to be part of the direct control. So you have 6 properties in Mission that are part of this direct control, where it won't stop the demolition of those properties, but it will limit what future development looks like. So you wouldn't have new development like front to back, side to side lot coverage, which is typically what you find in older neighborhoods. The city's residential grant program. So here's an example of the Jackson residence before restoration and the Jackson residence after restoration. So the city has $1 million as of the 2023 budget. They match funds up to 50% of costs, and the total grant is not to exceed $125,000 within 15 years per property. So the idea there is if, say you needed to do masonry work on this house, the cost was $50,000, the city would cover $25,000, and the property owner would cover $25,000. And if the incentive program is only available for designated properties. So you'd have to have your house designated, it'd have to have the designation bylaw, etc., because then that's the trade that the city is seeing. They're seeing a property designated, and the homeowner is seeing value through the city's grant program. There's also a provincial grant program which offers conservation work. Of matching grants is $100,000 for provincial historic resources and $50,000 for municipal historic resources. And they also offer grants for studies and professional services. If you needed some engineering work, to shore up your foundation, you could hire a consultant. The province would fund that of up to $25,000 max, and then you could then apply for the conservation grants through both the province and the city. So for those properties that are needing conservation work and restoration work done, they see the value in designating their property. And that could be anything that's a character defining element. You could also update, I think plumbing is included, electrical. If you had knob and tube wiring, you could use the city's grant program to also pay for that as well. And so looking at some examples of redevelopment and adaptive reuse, you have the Nimmons residence, which was built in 1898 as a ranch house. It was designated in 1924, and it was moved to allow a rental unit to be built as kind of an L-shaped around it. So it was moved 3 times on its location to allow for the parkade and all the structure that was needed to build the L shape. So it moved it was located kind of over here, more on the northwest corner, and it was moved to more of the southeast corner. It's now a law office, and the kind of courtyard there is called Nimmons Court, and the property is actually called Nimitz Court as well. So they took the name of the Nimitz House and incorporated it into their development. When the developer was going through their land use, there was nothing that required them to keep that property. It wasn't designated. They could have just demolished it and built their multi-family property, but they decided to make the investment to move it 3 times, put it on a new foundation, and turn it into a fully functioning law office. Is there anything else on that one I wanted to add? And then, of course, the King Edward Hotel, which was built in 1905 and then had a 1910 addition and was legally protected in 2007. You can see the addition on the back, which was 1910, and the 1905 is kind of that front 3-story. And you can see on the right, all the bricks, all the paint was stripped from the brick. They were able to find original ghost signage, and that's now part of the King Eddie Hotel as part of the National Music Center. And of course, you can see this is the backside of the hotel, and of course they built part of the National Music Center there on the west side, and then kind of have the Cavalier that goes across to the east side of the National Music Center as well. So they removed all the paint, etc. They were able to find that old ghost signage, and I guess when they had kind of reopened the King Eddie Hotel, there was tourists that would come in and ask if they actually had a room to rent because they weren't aware that it was no longer a hotel that was in use. The Simmons building, which is located in East Village along the Bow River, of course it was an old mattress factory, and in the early 2000s the city and the Calgary Municipal Land Corporation spent a great deal of time and money to restore the building and turn it into kind of a must-go place in East Village, and was kind of an anchor for the redevelopment of East Village. They have Char Bar, Phil and Sebastian, and Sidewalk Citizen there as kind of their 3 cornerstone restaurants. And it's a great place to grab a coffee and kind of stroll along the river promenade towards the zoo, Inglewood, etc. So it was built in 1912. It was pre-World War I manufacturing and industrial. So they had to put in an electrical elevator, sprinkler system. They had to shore up the foundation. But when you go in, you can see the amazing post and beam construction there. And it operated until 1966, when basement flooding prompted the move to a new site. And then it was kind of just used as city storage up until the late 90s, early 2000s. Another really good example is the King Edward School in Marda Loop, which of course is now called C-Space. They built a new theater space here on the west side, so it would have had a wing here, and on this side it had a 1950s, 1960s gym. So they took the gym off, restored this wing of the school. This side was too badly damaged, so they built the theater space and kind of that flex use space. But it's 100% programmed, 100% leased, and a great example of adaptive reuse. And the other thing that they were able to do is they subdivided the property and sold one side as kind of high-end condos and the other side as assisted living. So that was cash that they were able to also use to help offset their construction and their restoration costs as well. And of course, this is one of the sandstone schools that dates from the 1910 population boom, when you saw a majority of the sandstone schools that were built. You went from kind of the cottage school to the bungalow schools to the sandstone schools, because Calgary's population was just booming in the 1910s, that they just had to build schools in order to keep up with all of the population boom. So yeah, it was 20 sandstone schools that were built between 1892 and 1920, and I think it was used as a school up until the 1970s, somewhere in there, and then was converted to C-Space in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And just, you can see, this was the original rendering, so it very much turned out of what the renderings were going to look like. The cost to do that restoration was $33 $1.5 million, and it was split between the City of Calgary, Calgary Arts Development, the Calgary Foundation, the province, and I think the feds kicked in some money as well. So in conclusion, heritage assets provide the foundation for the future. Their benefits are economic, social, and environmental, and incentives are available and need to be to assist with redevelopment and adaptive reuse. And I'm happy to answer questions, conversation, whatever it might
So
be.
Josh, if the city wants to designate residents historically and put it on titles, does the landowner refuse to have that done, or what?
So the property owner would have to initiate it.
But not, what about the city of Calgary or any city initiating?
If they wanted to do it,
Yes.
they could, but they'd have to then compensate the property owner for perceived economic loss.
Oh, okay.
So that's where that piece comes in. That the municipalities could designate a property against the owner's wishes, but they would then have to compensate them, and no municipality has done that. So
Okay.
they use the carrot approach where property owners say, yep, I'm interested in designation. They go through the whole process.
Yep.
Then it's designated as a municipal historic resource.
And once it's designated, it stays designated irrespective of ownership.
Irrespective of ownership. But council in theory could repeal the bylaw because it's just a bylaw. Council could repeal it. But it's the opinion of both Heritage Calgary and the Planning and Development Department of the city that designation bylaws should not be rescinded. There's been talk of it in the last couple of years of, let's rescind this so we can either move it or we want to redevelop it. And the firm approach has been, no, we're not interested in de-designation. And that was the case of the Nimmons residence, where the designation bylaw originally came forward. The developer said, hey, I have someone that's interested, but they may want to move it. So the city didn't designate it until it was moved and then designated it. So that's what they'll do sometime as well. They'll pass first reading of that designation bylaw and then kind of allow the development to happen, and then they'll designate it. They did that similarly with the livery stable in Inglewood, where it was a white barn, and before they designated it, they had to move the barn north to build a proper foundation, moved it back onto its foundation, built I think about 7 row houses, kept the barn, turned it into on-site parking and a loft upstairs as a unit. And the property owner, the developer, was able to do that through the grant program that the city had and some of the relaxations as part of having a heritage resource. Yes?
So the key actor in this is really the municipality.
Yeah.
So you're gonna see a broad spectrum of approaches throughout the province, because each municipality has its own.
Yeah.
And a wide range of how protected they are, I guess, for want of putting it.
Yeah. Each municipality kind of has their own heritage program. Some have heritage advisory boards that kind of look after their registry. Some have designated sites as MHRs, or they look to the province to designate sites as PHRs because they're also provincially significant. The province in I think the early 2000s kind of helped a lot of smaller municipalities set up kind of some of their heritage programs. And so you see heritage programs in communities like Lacombe, Medicine Hat, Carstairs, Airdrie, obviously Calgary and Edmonton. But Calgary and Edmonton are kind of the only municipalities that have standalone heritage planning departments, just because of their size of population and land mass.
I assume Red Deer is also.
I think Red Deer also has, I think they have a heritage advisory board, and I think they've been slowly building up their heritage program.
Because their downtown is pretty old.
Yeah. So it's really kind of up to municipalities as to how they're going to set up their municipal heritage program, how they're going to resource it with a planner or a heritage advisory board, how they're going to set up their registry, etc. We've assisted lots of municipalities with kind of saying, here's our evaluation handbook, take what you want with it. Ours was set up, or last updated in 2008, and is kind of the gold standard when it comes to inventory systems in North America. And our online map is kind of the Cadillac when it comes to online evaluation systems, because you're able to see both the statement of significance, the character defining elements, and all the other information. Lots of other municipalities, while they'll have an online inventory, you can't get the statement of significance or kind of some of that historical information, where Calgary in the last number of years, they've made capital upgrades to our inventory system to allow all that information to be accessible to anyone in the world.
Excellent.
Have you ever come across a situation, Josh, where the landowner owns a residence where it's being historically designated and on title, and they're trying to sell it, and they know they can get more for it if the designation is not on it, so they try to get it off, which they can't. In the end, they just let it physically deteriorate?
So, yeah, so that's that demolition by neglect.
Yeah.
And so we do see that. We see that more with commercial buildings than residential properties. Commercial being, a previous owner has designated it, it's changed hands, and then you have a current landlord, usually a REIT, real estate investment trust that's not based in Calgary, let alone Western Canada, who are just kind of, it's just an asset, right? So to them it doesn't mean anything, it's just on their books. And so we have a couple situations in Calgary right now where we have at least 2 sets of assets that are just crumbling, and unfortunately there's nothing that can be done. Both Edmonton and Calgary in the past have asked multiple provincial governments to give them the power to enforce heritage designations, and the province has shown no interest in that. So the only ability is through like the community standards bylaw, but that's quite limited in terms of demolition by neglect. As long as the property is, not unsafe, etc., there's not a whole lot that municipal enforcement can do.
Thank you.
So what's the association between the historic designation and having it registered on land title?
So designation, and then the final step is registering it on the land title, and that's required under the Historic Resources Act.
Provincially?
Provincially.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Historic Resources Act, it governs designations in Alberta. So municipal governments get their ability to designate sites as provincial historic resources through the Historic Resources Act, which has also not been updated since 2000. And we've asked multiple consecutive governments to consider updating the Historic Resources Act, because it also oversees archaeological and a number of other kind of heritage and historical elements in the province.
Anyone have any more questions for Josh?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, sorry, Donna.
Oh, this is
Go ahead.
a counselor. So what do you want changed with the provincial statute?
So with the Historic Resources Act, we would like the ability for enforcement when it comes to designation. We would also like the ability of municipalities to be able to act faster when it comes to designation. Right now with the 60-day notice, if a property owner has signed off, there's no need to provide notice because they've already provided notice. And we also want to see the province have more grants that are available. Calgary has $1 million in our conservation grant program, and the province for their entire HPPP program has $2.4 million. And we've seen no increases since at least 2015, when the Prentice government decreased overall funding. It was not returned by the NDP, and we've seen no inflationary increases to the HPPP program in the last 8, 9, 10 years. So kind of really small things of just, we need funding to keep up with the demand. There's more and more designations coming in for a pool of money that has not grown at all. And so in turn, the province has had to lower the amount that they can give to properties in order to make more grants available to Albertans.
So in reality, there isn't a hierarchy. It's not the province, the municipality, and then people personally. The province really doesn't have anything to do with it except say, yeah, we'll put you on land title.
The province, through the Historic Resources Act, that's the legislation, but the ultimate designation and enforcement falls to the municipality unless a site is a provincial historic resource, which then if it is a provincial historic resource, the same rules apply, where sites can't be demolished or significantly altered without the Historic Resources Management branch at the province signing off, etc.
Okay, that's the only basic authority they
Yeah,
have.
so yeah, whether it's a provincial site or a municipal site, the same restrictions still apply. It's just a different level of government that enforces it. And then federally, there's no legal protections. Sites can be recognized by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, but that's honorific only. It doesn't come with any legal protection. It's just that bronze plaque saying your site, is historically significant, but it can still be demolished, altered, etc.
Okay, no legal ramifications
No.
federally?
No, nothing federally, just provincially and municipally.
Would there be any desire sort of to go down a similar model like in the UK where they have grade 1 listed, grade 2 listed, star listed? Or
So
is it people like this?
that's how the old way that inventories were done, is they kind of had a rating system, and then kind of in the early 2000s, most evaluation systems moved to a values-based system where one of those values has to be attached to the heritage property. We don't have a heritage trust like many European countries do. We have one in Canada, but it doesn't function in the same way. Albertans and Canadians really love their property rights. They don't want someone to tell them what to do with their property, but they're more than happy to tell their neighbor what they can do with their property. Any other questions? And I'm happy to share my presentation. I'll send it to you, Lynn, if you want
That would be awesome.
to send it
I would
around
really appreciate that.
to anyone as well.
Yes.
I just wonder what percentage of, your big circles, the 4,000, the 4,000 resource heritage assets. And then your inventory, 965, how many of those actually make it into the 163? Like, they have to apply themselves, right?
So I think the last number of years, we've seen about 7 to 10 designations a year.
Okay.
So we're adding 30 to 40 sites to that gray circle of the inventory, and then 7 to 8 of that gray circle goes to that orange circle.
But you have to be in the green circle before you can even attempt to get to the other
gray
circles?
circle. You have to be in the gray circle first before you can go to the orange circle.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that idea there to be in the gray circle is that you have heritage significance, you have character-defining elements. Oftentimes people will call us and say, something is being torn down, and we have to say just because it's old doesn't necessarily make it heritage. It has to be historically or architecturally significant. Does it have original character-defining elements?
So it has to match the values.
It has to
Yeah,
match the
yeah,
values.
yeah.
And that's how we use it, is that values-based system where it either does or doesn't. And then once it is in the gray circle in the inventory, that's then when the incentives come into play to encourage property owners to consider designation.
Sorry.
Yep.
It has to come from the property owner,
Yeah.
the request. But do you guys sort of go around and knock on somebody's door and go, we really think that,
So we do that through the inventory process. So when we identify sites, and those can come through any way. When I first started at Heritage Calgary, 90% of the sites that we added to the inventory, there was no owner involvement whatsoever, and that's on a total 180. We're almost 85% of the sites we add to the inventory now, the owner reached out to us and said, hey, I'm interested in getting on the inventory, or I'm interested in designation, and we say, okay, let's get you on the inventory. So when we have an owner that's involved, our researchers can then have more access to the property, right? If an owner's not involved, they can't step foot off the property line, so they have to just look at the house from the street. Where if the property owner's involved, they can go take photos. Oftentimes that property may have old photos, that date from the maybe 70s or 80s, or if they've lived there even longer, you can look at those photos and see how houses have changed over the years. And then sometimes you have some houses where owners have passed down, old land titles, old photos, etc. And when you find those houses, it's a gold mine because you're kind of able to trace back all the way to, the first people that built there, lived it, etc. So we're seeing more and more interest from property owners that are either interested in the inventory or designation.
Right, also, but are they notified when they get on the
Inventory.
heritage list?
So when they get on the inventory, they are notified.
When they're on the
Yeah.
inventory, but prior to that, your 4,000.
Heritage assets, no.
They're not notified.
They're not notified.
So
No.
they don't know that they could apply, really,
Yeah.
there's nothing.
Yeah, so that's where part of our job through public outreach, where we do, like Heritage Matters, the how-tos of heritage designation. We'll partner with community associations in some of those older neighborhoods. We have, online guides, etc., to encourage people
To
to.
encourage them to come to you.
Yeah.
You can't actually go
We
to
we
them.
can go to them. We've done that in the past.
Oh, if there's something really significant,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, exactly, and we've done that, where if sites come, someone might identify a site, and then we'll go and add it to the inventory. We send a notification letter to the property owner saying, hey, we're evaluating your property for inclusion on the inventory. Doesn't change your, the way you use your property. It's not registered on title. You can still demolish. You can still significantly alter, etc., etc., etc. 9 times out of 10, we don't even hear a word back. Sometimes we'll hear back and they'll say, yeah, that sounds great. Or they'll say, do not put my house on the heritage inventory. And we say, we're going to do it anyways. So, yeah.
Okay.
Because it goes back to that whole idea of the inventory being a record. So we sometimes, if sites that are not on the inventory are going to be demolished, we will still do the research to add them to the inventory, just so that there is a record of that site in the future. And then it also helps us do commemoration as well. If a site has to be demolished, can we at least place a plaque or some kind of commemoration to show what used to be there?
So we do have an inventory of historic resources in Cochrane. It's that thing we look at all the time, the back binder with all those buildings, some that are here and some that are gone. It's the designation that's only occurred once.
There you go. Our first site was designated in 1990. It took us 30 years to get to 100 designations in 2020. And so from 2020 to 2024, we've seen a 56% increase in designations. So that, when you just look at the numbers year over year, we're seeing way more interest in designation in the last 5 years than we did in the last 30 years.
Any more questions or comments? Well, Josh, I'd like to thank you very much for coming
Well,
out tonight.
thank you very much for having me.
And I'd like to pass on this gift to you.
Oh, wonderful.
This is our history book. And the first one is the Big Hill Country. This
Yeah.
is the, you might say, the update, which our organization published, put together.
Wonderful.
So it's Big Hill, more Big Hill Country. And there's a check in there for you too.
Oh, thank you.
Honorarium. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We definitely appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
I love these books. I have a few of them from different places.
Oh, good, good.